Let's get started. Everybody take a seat, please. We'll open with Mr. Gladwell leading us in invocation and the pledge.
Father, we thank you for this day, Lord, and your many blessings. We thank you for our county and all the people here. Then we thank you for allowing us to participate in our future. We ask now that you'd be with us and that you would lead and guide us, and that you would help us to make wise decisions in the best interest of our people. And we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Mac, show's yours, buddy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Commissioners. Matt Carpenter for the Planning Department, C-A-R-P-E-N-T-E-R. We're happy to have online Ms. Marina, the head of DPZ CoDesign. And we have this morning for you an update on our long-range planning project, the update to our comprehensive plan. And they are looking for some direction. Once they give you the update on where we are and the recommendation on where they think we should be going. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Marina, and we'll get started.
Marina, before you start, what happened?
Yes.
Before you start, if you would spell your name for the clerk.
Yes. Good morning, everyone. My name is Marina Corey, and I'm with the DPZ CoDesign.
Do you have the spelling? Okay.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Great. So I have a presentation for you. I will end it with 3 specific questions we have for you. You don't have to give us answers today, but it will hopefully prompt some thinking. And I will be followed by Joe Minicosi of Urban 3, who will give a presentation on the economics of land design and how their work is also helping inform what we suggest for you. So today's presentation is essentially organized with a very brief reminder of what our existing conditions assessment has entailed. And then I'd like to move forward with some growth management scenarios, explaining a little bit in greater detail what the place types are that we're recommending, how we think they should be applied in the county, and then hopefully opening it up for a Q&A session. So here's where we are in the process. We've completed our assessment of existing conditions and the comp plan assessment as well, and we are beginning to work through the recommendation phase and making a series of recommendations, not only from a planning standpoint, but from a infrastructure, transportation, coastal management, and conservation standpoint as well. We have another 4 months, so we're about 5 months, here, with the aim to wrap this up in March of next year. So let's look at what our existing conditions has yielded. I'm going to review this section quickly, as you've already seen it, but we've reviewed both your FLU and your zoning categories to understand how they nestle into each other, where the issues are, and where there are inconsistencies amongst them. We know you probably have too many preservation categories. You also have too many categories generally yielding the same result. Here's one example. You see 4 different types of mixed-use centers, each that generally yield the same number of units, except in the Coastal Village 1, with different FARs sometimes, but the same density, which is also confusing. So to have a density of 12, with one having an FAR of 0.5 and another one of 2, doesn't make a lot of sense. So we're asking ourselves, why are these needed? Can they be consolidated? Can they be more rationalized to at least yield really different results? The whole point of zoning categories is each one to yield something slightly different, otherwise why have it? And we've been lucky to have Gridic working with us, who can give us very quickly the analysis of what the zoning really allows in terms of all its dimensional requirements and what it permits. So this is, I'm going to show you a close-up of this so on the next page, so you don't have to really scrutinize it. But essentially, we needed to understand the intent of each FLU and zoning, and we've made comments on each, suggesting where we should delete a category. It's sometimes less than one handful. Sometimes only one parcel in the entire county has that designation. So let's consolidate where it makes sense. It's important for us to understand this thoroughly because you have a property rights element which requires respecting the entitlements property owners have, but you can try shape them into a better form. So you'll have to decide if there's any areas you want to quote unquote, what we call down zone. And if you agree to do that or even up zone certain areas, that can be done through what we call a TDR program or transfer of development rights, so that we could hypothetically pick areas where you want to incentivize development and areas where you may want to do more aggressive preservation. So here's an example of it. You can see the flu category and all the zoning categories it encompasses. On the left, you see this is the mixed use category. On the right, you see that there's about 7 zoning categories that fit within it. And as you can see here in our recommendation section, we are suggesting where you should consolidate, where you should retain, where you should outright delete. Now, we have not reviewed this with county staff yet. They will have things to say about this, but this is our first pass at really trying to understand how we can try simplify your zoning where it makes sense. So I know I have met with each of you individually and I've discussed these issues with you too. You know the problems your zoning has, and it is our hope that the recommendations we put forth can directly provide solutions for some, if not many, of these problems. So here it is. I won't read this other to maybe pick on a few. The neighborhood infill, while well-intentioned, is a Band-Aid. It's one size fits all. It's one zoning category, but by definition, it should be calibrated differently depending on where you are in the county, right? So neighborhood infill shouldn't have the same if it's next to residential preservation or if it's next to an urban mixed-use center, as an example. It's a good idea. It just needs to be properly addressed. Density and FAR, as I mentioned, are not always aligned, and we think you should be deprioritizing use and emphasizing form instead. So we hope we can really allow you to align your densities to your desired building types, in particular, so that it can support your generally very good comp plan policies that you have established. So how do I know this? We've also taken each of your 10 comp plan elements and the policies included in each of them, and we have suggested whether they should remain as is or change a little or a lot, significantly, or maybe with minor edits. Where we are recommending changes, they're included in the column in the right. And it's a highly technical document. You will be provided a copy of it. We sent it to Stephen last night. It may be boring for many, but it has helped our team zero in on the most pertinent issues that we need to address. And generally, as I mentioned, your policies all say the right thing, but evidently your zoning is not yielding those results. So we'll be making recommendations to try fix that moving forward to meet these policies and how your zoning needs to be adapted to help reinforce that. So that's it for our assessment. Now I want to move into what are possible solutions. So this is an example of your very unusual zoning, which explains sort of why you look the way you do. It's a little haphazard, and there are obvious fixes that are needed. So for example, here you see a town center 1 intruding on a conservation area, and here you see a conservation intruding on public facilities in town center. So how can this be reconciled? We're thinking about that. At the top, you also see this sort of confetti pattern of neighborhood infill, small neighborhood, residential preservation. And so why it needs to be so different is unbeknownst to us. And it maybe explains why residents in these areas, like the Chat Holly, have such angst when they see projects come forward, because it's not reinforcing a general understanding of what that character needs to be like. So we're hoping that the place types we suggest for you can help you do that. Now, so how can you grow more logically, sensibly, make sense of where that growth should occur? You will continue growing. You've reaped the many benefits that have come from that fast growth, as well as the challenges that it has created. And each of you have made us aware of those in great detail. Here are the university's predictions for that continued growth, and we've used those figures to help us try to define a strategy of where growth should happen and where it should, sort of at what intensity, to, as best we can, align it with the underlying zoning. In the best case scenario, it has to be done in a way that is more consistent and predictable than what you have. So at the very low end, they're saying by 2040, you will have 26,000 more housing units. At the high end, another 41,000. So it's not insignificant, but you will continue growing. So we just have to confront that, because some people have said to us, why can't we just stop growth? And you just can't. It's unrealistic. Property owners already have development rights, so let's find a way to help them manage that in a better way. So why are we suggesting what we call place type? Number one, your 1996 trust plan introduced that concept, which you've incorporated into your into your comprehensive plan, because some of your flu categories are already place types, while others are land use based. What we're trying to do is to figure out a way to reconcile them. And we've looked at what your different settlement patterns are in the county. You have rural settlement patterns, you have urban settlement patterns, and you have suburban settlement patterns. And we're really trying to define them more logically, and then tell you where they should be applied. And I'm going to review each and every one of them. You have centers, you have corridors, you have settlements or communities, and then you have the others. And the others are the industrial areas, the agricultural areas, Eglin, etc., that we're not going to change at all. So there are 4 types. Not all are mapped. None of them have to, just some do, and we're suggesting that the ones that are highlighted in pink are, and I'll show you why. So for example, all your corridors don't need to be designated as either urban, rural, natural, or suburban. One can argue you only need to designate where you want urban corridors, and I'll explain the difference, but it's essentially where do you want walkability to be expressly encouraged. Then you could or could not map rural and natural corridors. Those are easy to map because they either traverse natural or rural areas, and by default, all your other corridors would become suburban until they're ready to change to urban. So that's one way to look at this, and I'm going to review each of these different place types with you. Here are the different types of natural and environmental place types you have. They're easy enough to map. You've done so already, and you know them well, and you have a tremendous wealth of natural place types, which is really what is so unique and beautiful about your county, and absolutely worth preserving. This slide illustrates the difference between the urban and the suburban corridors. So the urban one has buildings along wide tree-lined sidewalks. Parking is typically hidden in the rear. And on the other, you have parking lots between the buildings and the sidewalks, if they exist, and the street's not particularly hospitable for bikers or pedestrians. It's okay, you have both, you will continue to have both, but where you can encourage better urban frontages, you should. And where you know you want better urban frontages is where we would encourage the designation of urban corridors, so that when those areas redevelop, they redevelop in a manner that is on the left more so than the manner on the right. We now know from an economic standpoint, from a fiscal standpoint, from what Joe Minicosi is going to show you, that the places on the left are much more valuable, much more resilient economically than the places on the right. But a county as diverse as yours needs both, and by no means are we recommending you shouldn't have the suburban. But even if you do have suburban corridors, there are ways to manage it better than what you currently have, and we'll be suggesting ways to do that. Again, easy to map your rural and natural corridors, and they will remain that way for the foreseeable future, so that you can be assured that along natural corridors, no development is happening, and along rural corridors, a very limited type of development is happening. Now, in terms of your community or your settlement type, you already know the T&Ds. Seaside is an example of a T&D. You have villages too. What we're calling villages, there may be better names for it, but for example, Hammock Bay may be an example of a village. It has pods of residential uses. It is more mixed use, but the mixed uses tend to be concentrated in one area, and you have one type of house next to another type of house, but it's trying to be of a place type, and those should be encouraged. Not every developer wants to do a T&D. It's complicated, it's expensive. So the next type is what we call a village, which is slightly less mixed use, but still showing corridors, forming open space, trying to hide the parking, etc. And then you have the other 2 types, which also exist and will continue to exist. The suburban types are less desirable. They may not have sidewalks, they may not have backyards, as you see in this case, and they are isolated from other uses and even other residential use types, and they are essentially auto-dependent. The rural ones are concentrated mostly in the northern end. They're reserved for very large lots for people who don't want to be bothered and want to continue living the rural lifestyle. That's fine. One could argue you could try and encourage rural clustering in some places, where you want to preserve more open space and give those homeowners, even those who live in these areas, the ability to maybe walk to one of their daily needs on foot or by bike, wherever they are. So there are ways in which to manage the rural place types while keeping them rural, not remotely increasing the density, but maybe encouraging different settlement patterns as well. So how would we map this? This is a very complicated chart, and I'm going to explain it to you slide by slide by slide. But essentially, you have 4 options for moving forward. 2 we're not recommending, and 2 we are, with the clear preference for 1, which we think affords you the most flexibility. So the first option is to essentially tweak your FLU and your zoning, but essentially not disrupt what you have, just provide fixes where it's possible. That will be the least satisfying option to you for all except maybe for those developers who know how to take advantage of the system. So we're not really recommending it. But if you really don't want to change a lot, we would tell you, okay, we already know how you can make certain adjustments to your zoning, to your FLU, here it is. But we think you should aspire to more. Option 4 is, we're also not recommending, because it's highly ambitious, but it's converting your entire FLU to place type. It's complex. It can take years. We just did this with Orange County, Florida, where they've converted their entire FLU to place types. But it is possible and would yield the most consistent and predictable results. However, at this stage, there are intermediate steps, which I think we would encourage you to first take and possibly revisit this option a few years from now if you like the use of place types and if you're finding that it is giving you the results that you want. So while this is a valid option, it's very ambitious, so it would be politically very difficult to do, but not impossible. But we think there are more reasonable options to explore given the makeup of your county. So option 2 is what many saw. This is what we presented at the charrette in May, which is to say, map place types proactively in your FLU, where places are already trending towards such place types. It is possible to do, but you still need a mechanism to decide where should we allow certain place types and where should we not. So why is this? This is certainly a possibility, but as we showed during our charrette, we explored meeting the 2040 population projections by assigning different place types to different areas depending on those types. And the results can be very different. How many urban centers would you want? How many rural centers would you want? How many urban corridors? How many possible TNDs, etc. So depending on where those are mapped and how the corridors are mapped, the population would be very different. It's not impossible to do at all, but it means being very proactive about where those happen. And we don't know. We don't know which developer is going to come forward with X amount of acres who may want to do something. So that's option 2. The option 3 is actually the one we're recommending. And it's there's an interim step which you can do right away. So what it is we would encourage you to develop what we call a sector map. That's a map over very large areas. And we've suggested 3 sectors: a preservation sector, a maintained sector, and a growth sector. So the preservation is for all those areas that are essentially not going to allow development, or where they do, it's very, very little. The maintained are those areas that they're predominantly in the south of the bay, those areas that have already developed, that aren't going to change in the foreseeable future, and that have already taken advantage of the majority of the entitlements that they already have based on the zoning that's underlying it. And the growth sector is those areas that can grow by virtue of the fact that what's built on the ground or what's not already developed doesn't match the zoning. So we've mapped those, and we've taken a very quick, this is not by any means a precise map. It's not our role to map this as part of the scope. It's our role to give you the criteria by which you would map this. And we would want to help county staff do this. But we would be encouraging you to look at the areas around the existing municipalities, for example, Freeport and Defuniak, which we know are experiencing a lot of growth. Identify those areas that are the growth sectors, and then the areas that are the maintained sectors. And then within those different sectors, only certain place types are allowed. So for example, if a property owner has 100 acres and wants to develop a TND, if they're in the growth sector, they can. If they're in the maintained sector, they cannot. They can do a TND settlement in both. Sorry, they can't do an urban center in the maintained. They can do one in the growth, because the idea is to really keep the maintain area the way it looks, and the grow, allow it to evolve into more logical places. So here is our first rough pass at assigning those sectors. Of course, we've had to work with the underlying zoning. So our role is to give you the mechanism by which you can do it. But you can sort of see how it breaks out. In the north, it's mostly preserved with very little grow, and the grow is assigned where the general commercial zoning is assigned, or the FLU. The south is a mixture of both, and the central is the area most likely to experience the greatest change, because that's where development is moving, and that's also where the capacity is to accommodate some of that change. You will decide whether you may very well say, we want way more maintain and way less grow. That's perfectly possible. That'll be for you and county staff to determine. We'll help you get there. But remember, it has to coincide with the underlying zoning that's below. So an area that's zoned for commercial is very hard to say maintain if what's built on there is a one-story building, for example, but it's allowed to go to 4. So now I want to show you examples of how all of these can play out. And the most challenging has been the rural center, of course. And the rural center is a perfect example of how the county did some things right and some things wrong. You were right to assign commercial parcels at the intersection of rural areas up north in the northernmost parcel. Unfortunately, it was assigned over way too large an area. And it's given the exact same zoning as is assigned to the most urban areas in the south. So hypothetically, if the services were here, 4-story buildings could go here. Highly unlikely, but what the grid shows us is that what is permitted versus what is built, there's a huge discrepancy. So because there are no services here yet, because the market isn't calling for 4-story buildings here yet, we don't have to worry about it now. But we know from an environmental standpoint, the loss of the natural habitat and even natural areas for agriculture or even recreation is one of the greatest issues facing many places right now. And the very, very low density development also encourages sort of car-dependent development. We also know that places with more traditional patterns of development with very small mixes that are appropriate for rural areas with smaller development footprints can help reduce those development infrastructure needs. So immediately you could encourage a small mix of building types that a rural center needs. That's where you could eventually potentially say, we're going to provide, when the time is right, when property owners come to develop, services or the infrastructure for the mixed use that you see, that you see only in the center here. We're going to encourage that here. We won't provide the infrastructure out here there, because you don't necessarily want to see a slew of 5-story buildings in this area. You would want to see a small mix of building types, but that is it, and very quickly allow it to feather out to the single-family housing that's appropriate for these areas. So thinking about bringing infrastructure to a limited area could help align the place type with the zoning that it underlies. Here's, of course, an example of what that could look like. So we could imagine this area redeveloping in a manner that is sensible and compatible with its existing development. And the county staff asked us to provide examples of that intensity and character of development. So these are some from our other projects. They're not intended to be representative of Walton County, but they are representative of rural place types. So you see a lot of open space. You see agricultural and rural land preserved. You see clustering of buildings in exchange for open space being preserved. You see buildings laying lightly on the ground. The vast majority of them are detached buildings with very few attached buildings, often around a green or a central space that becomes a community focal point. And they become very charming places. At the other end of the spectrum, of course, are the urban centers, and that's the most urban type. The characteristics are listed here. They're located only at the intersections of very main thoroughfares. They have the most robust mix of possible building types, very little single family. The majority is medium intensity mixed use. And what do we mean by that? You see the building types that are allowed in the medium intensity by your own zoning. So townhouses, small multifamily, live work, medium multifamily, large multifamily. Some low intensity, which are the cottages, the townhouses, and then very little single family. And we would encourage you to allow or even require developers who come to you who have amassed a certain amount of land to develop with this kind of robust mix. And what we intend to do is give you what that mix should be. It would be a range so that you provide the property owners with the greatest flexibility that could still yield the kind of results you would want to see here. So here's an example of where it could be applied. You see the flu categories here. This is the intersection of 331 over and the bay, of course. And you also see the quarter-mile pedestrian shed, which represents that 5-minute walk from the center to the edge. You see it overlaid over Seaside too. It's only shown as a comparison, but it's there to show you the mix of building types and street types and all of that exists within this area. Now, there's already 3 flu categories here, the residential and the mixed use, as you can see here. The majority of it is mixed use. The zoning is neighborhood infill, residential preservation, and village mixed use. So you could imagine if this sector is the growth sector, you would remove the 3 flu categories here, and all of a sudden it becomes an urban center. So you aren't going to have a lot of urban centers, but this is one where it really does make sense. More than the town center you have below, which is already surrounded by a lot of conservation areas. And so this area would be mapped for that mixed-use zoning. And now, the other thing we want to do is encourage you to then ask developers who avail themselves of these place types to develop following more rigorous zoning standards. And we would want to give you form-based standards for the areas that have place types. So initially, you would have both systems, but it's not that different to what T&Ds do now. T&Ds all develop under their own design guidelines. Some are better, some are worse. Why not have standard rules that most of them apply anyways, and you could test them out here, and if it works, you can quickly transition them to other parts of the county. And of course, here is an example of what that looks like: buildings shaping streets and public plazas, parking hidden in the rear, and really vibrant streets designed to be walkable and bikeable and encouraging of an active street life. And then the TOD centers are interesting. They're assigned up and down your rail line where stops would one day become feasible. For some people, again, this is looking 20 years down the line, so it may not be immediately feasible, but it can be feasible. And we think that you really have the ability to allow for some wonderful places to transition to these TOD centers where you could allow for a very robust mix of industrial and commercial buildings, but also entire towns can grow around it. And that's what this could look like. And you can see the illustrations taking advantage of the topography, transitioning very quickly to residential uses, and showing how the industrial uses or the higher commercial uses can be compatible with residential uses. And we've done this in many places, of course, TODs all around the country, and there are many strategies by which even the big buildings can be buffered, lined with different buildings to create an appropriate transition to more residential areas. But that's a potential for significant and a wonderful development in Walton County. And so then the second one are the corridors. There are 3 center types, and you could see how each of them would encourage a different mix of buildings. So for example, a rural center has no medium intensity buildings whatsoever. There are none, whereas the other 2 do. It also has a much higher ratio, of course, of single-family housing and rural housing than neither the urban. The TOD has a little bit of it because sometimes it does traverse currently now rural areas. But again, as I mentioned, would make recommendations for the mix required for each of this to ensure that you get that place type while providing for the necessary flexibility that each of them require. So what do those, and then so then here they are. The rural corridor, as I mentioned, these are its characteristics, located along long segments of secondary corridors adjacent to either agricultural landscapes or rural settlements. They provide limited access to surrounding areas. They often contain wide landscaping buffers, and you want to protect their character. So this will be easy to map across the county, and as you can see here, it doesn't really allow for any kind of mixed use until you would get to the rural center. And those rural centers, that's where you would begin to allow that mix. The urban corridors are the very important ones that need to be mapped. Where do you want to encourage a more sustainable pattern of development? You want to make sure it's assigned to both sides of the street. You want to tame that street from a walkability standpoint to ensure that it allows cars to move, but also people and bikes. And it's typically assigned to one lot deep only on both sides of the street. And it's mostly for that medium intensity mixed use building type that you can see here, which allows for all these building types that you see here. 98 is a perfect example of where you would want large chunks of 98 to be assigned the urban corridor, where the transit stops occur or will occur in the foreseeable future, where there are only one-story buildings, but they can redevelop to four-story buildings, and where you already have this kind of development beginning to happen. Let's standardize it and really encourage it on both sides so you can create places immediately, and then in between those urban corridors, it remains suburban. And here's the renderings of what that character can look like. Often the tallest buildings are pushed to the front of the lot so that the transition to less intense areas, often single-family neighborhoods, can be less abrupt and more in keeping with the character of those neighborhoods. They may also have a formal civic space as a square or a plaza either facing the street or perpendicular to the street. Sometimes they offer Main Street running perpendicular to that main thoroughfare. And they're, of course, always intended to be highly walkable. And the suburban corridors, as I've mentioned, you have them, you will continue to have them. What will be important, and as we describe in the report, is how you begin to standardize, where possible, the different frontage conditions along certain streets. So there are some areas where you may only want to say, we only want to allow one bay of parking and a street, and then, you know, little green strips. The building sits back, but you can imagine how it's not that hard to cross it as pedestrians are walking along the sidewalk. There are other areas where you may say it's okay to have entire parking lots in front of the buildings. And then there may be, and there's a whole slew of options. Where is it possible to encourage angle parking? Where should you encourage parallel parking? We're giving you the range of those options and thinking it would be, and we've categorized where they exist in your own county and where it makes sense, where possible, to begin to standardize those. It's important to recognize that this form of development will continue, but there are ways to still ensure that it's still, even these kinds of areas can be made more pedestrian friendly. You can encourage shared driveways where possible, all that type of stuff, so you can minimize curb cuts, minimize where sidewalks are interrupted, etc. So even the suburban corridors can be made to be less aggressive towards pedestrians. And here, of course, are the differences between the rural and the urban types and the mix of buildings that are allowed. The urban and the suburban allow for the same, except that often you want the mixed use and the multifamily, in an area that is walkable, where they can walk to their daily needs, as opposed to multifamily buildings surrounded by parking and not walkable to anything, which is not where you want to be encouraging your multifamily to be located. And the last are the settlement types. So here you have the rural settlements. They are adjacent to the rural centers, is what you currently have right now. You may decide that you still want only the large lot development, but if there are opportunities where a property owner wants to preserve a lot of land around and may want to have a small area where they say, let us cluster a bit of a mix of building types, it's not all one lot size, we think that should be a mechanism that's allowed and even encouraged in exchange for that preservation of more land, and to allow for different types of buildings within rural centers. Otherwise, it does become what we call rural sprawl. We're very used to urban sprawl, but rural sprawl is a real thing, where you have very little housing and a tremendous amount of infrastructure that's required to support it. But it still recognizes that this has very, very little commercial. It's mostly rural housing as opposed to the rural center, but it does recognize that there still needs to be a mix of building types. And here's what that looks like. And it can be very charming with cottages and even senior housing surrounding a green where they can sit and enjoy the time that they have, during the day with their friends in these sort of shed kinds of open spaces, and still enjoy that rural lifestyle, which is very private and which is cherished. Then there's the village type, of course, and the village type has a mix of buildings, as you can see here. May not have a lot of the medium intensity mixed use. Some areas will have a little bit of it, but mostly not. You want to reserve that for your centers and your TNDs. And it's a lot of the type of housing you're getting, for example, through St. Joe, in some of their communities like Origin. And here's what that would look like. And then the suburban settlement, here's the characters. Of course, the character varies tremendously. It's mostly single family with some attached housing and a little bit of commercial mix. It doesn't mix commercial as robustly as a T&D would mix it. And there's nothing wrong with that. Not every place, as I mentioned before, will be a T&D. And then the suburban type are the ones that are often on cul-de-sacs, do not have alleys, so they're front-loaded. There are people who are perfectly happy living in conditions like this. They may not have sidewalks because the driveways interrupt them too much. That's okay. There'll be developers who want to do this. Your role is to figure out the ways in which they can, where you want to allow this and where you don't want to allow it. And we already have ideas of where that should be. You wouldn't have to map suburban settlement, but you would be mapping urban T&Ds and villages. Suburban settlement is everything else. And of course, the T&Ds, as you're most familiar with, that's the mixed use, the compact community, and the greatest variety of building types. And of course, the character of what that looks like. In different places, we could have put the seasides and Rosemary beaches here, of course, since you know those as well. But the 30A is a good example of that. 30A West, I think it's called, is a good example of those. And then here's the different, how you would begin to calibrate the characteristics of each. The rural having the greatest mix of rural, the village having a significant amount of village. Some would have very little rural, some would have a lot, but the village is predominantly single family, whereas a T&D may not be predominantly single family. It may have more of the low intensity mixed use type. So we want to provide you with the greatest variety of options, and then you decide where they make sense or not, depending on that sector. So the last thing is, how does this all translate to what you have right now? So how will we begin to do this? We would develop, as I mentioned, the sector map and begin to assign where they occur. We'd begin to say, these are the flu categories that fit into each of these types. So for example, the grow is where the mixed use and commercial is. The maintain may have some commercial. The preserve maintain has the large scale agriculture and large scale and general agriculture. We begin to define the place types that occur within these types, and then all your zoning that goes into those place types. So for example, your urban center gets all of these different zoning categories that exist. Down the line, and this is why this is grayed out, because it's too complicated to get into today, but we want to suggest how your zoning for those areas can be greatly simplified to encourage better form standards for these place types. So you have these applicable sector, what your current flu is right now, what are the proposed place types that would either replace or supplement these flus, and then the zoning that's permitted within each of them. And it is technical, and it requires, really studying these to understand them, but I think when you see our report and you begin to understand, as you know already very well, the different metrics for each of these zoning categories, why they have been assigned to these place types. And you see it for here, the settlement types. Sorry, these were for the center and the corridor types. We have it for the settlement types, and of course for the other types, which stay pretty much consistent. And the last few slides are showing you how that would be mapped. So for example, we took, and this will maybe give you a lot of reassurance. We took so you have right now, the way we mapped it, 78% of your land is mapped as preserved, 16% is grow, and 4.5% is maintained. You may want to recalibrate this, but again, as I mentioned, it depends on the underlying zoning. So at your high population, it would only, now we've mapped this just to show you, this is the only amount of land. You could accommodate the entire population just in occupying this amount of land as you see here. We're suggesting less in the south, more in the north. We're not saying it has to happen here or it has to happen here. We're just saying this little amount, if you were to say, we want to discourage the low intensity, we want to encourage high intensity, which is pretty much 15% single family home, mostly multifamily and some townhouses. This is the amount of land it would occupy. Only 2.4% of the total land of the county would be developed. If you did the high population at the low intensity, you would be occupying close to 6% of the land. So saying, no, we want more single family, the low intensity is 80% single family, 5% townhouses, 15% mixed use. The high intensity is 15% single family, 65% multifamily. This is us just playing around to get you an understanding of how much land you would occupy to accommodate these 20,000 units that may be coming in. That's what this is intended to show. Again, this is not intended to show that this is where the development would occur. It's intended to show this is how much land it would occupy. So, down the line, initially you would keep these flu categories, permit these place types where the sector maps allow them, and over time begin to lose these these flu types and only have these place types would replace them. It would take time, but it could happen, right? So for example, your mixed-use flu would allow urban corridor, T&D, village, even rural settlements, urban centers, and TODs. It's the most varied. For the foreseeable future, it's going to remain mixed use, but where the place types are assigned, now there would be different rules under which property owners would have to comply with, ideally. And these are all your others that really stay the same. So Eglin, conservation, general agriculture, industrial, large-scale ag, parks and rec, and public facilities would fall under other place types and would be given the same designation. So my last three questions, so this is my last slide for you before we go to Q&A, and it's perfect because I wanted to give us at least 20 minutes for this before we turn it over to Joe. Excuse me, could you please put that down? Okay. The first question is the sector map and place types approach acceptable to you all for us to move forward? We're assuming it is, but we want to make sure you're okay with that. The second question is, are there additional areas to consider for preservation or growth on the sector map? Do you think so right now we have maintain, preserve, growth. You will have to look at this map with county staff and really tweak it to define where are the maintain, where are the grow, where are the preserve. And the third one is, are there other place types that we should be considering that we may not have considered? And I'll open it up to questions. I know it's a lot of information, but hopefully it's since you've all heard this before, it's not completely foreign and has helped answer questions rather than, has provided some answers as opposed to more questions.
Any questions from the commissioners?
And I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that I can see you all.
That's a
on
lot
my
of
screen.
information. That is a lot of information to absorb. I'm a little overwhelmed with all of that. But I think I heard you say that you're going to go through this till March of 2025. Is that correct?
Correct.
What sort of breakdowns are you going to be working on from this point to then?
Well, so the reason we really insisted with Mac and his team that we wanted to present to you is because a lot is riding on us recommending place types. So if you are open to the idea of place types, which we hope you are, our recommendations are going to be based on that. But if you say to us, no, we don't want place types, we want to just keep our flu the way it is and go to option one, that means shifting how we think about the recommendations we put forth. We don't want to recommend place types if you all think you don't want to see it evolve to that. We think it's logical, it's how you already sort of exist, it's really just rationalizing more clearly that those types of places where they currently occur now and suggesting where they should occur in the future. But that is a big question for you because it's, so those three questions are important. Do you think it's a rational approach to move forward with place types?
Well, for me personally, I do think that it's a good approach to move forward because what we're doing right now is not working. So I think that we could be nothing but an improvement. So if, I believe out of the 5 that you brought up, there was one that you encouraged us to really look at. And I personally would like to take a stronger approach to look and see exactly what that entails. And I would be open to those suggestions to just make this less of a hodgepodge, like in the South End in certain areas, it's a lot of a hodgepodge, not a lot of thought went into it. And so if there's something that you can show us that would streamline that, and I agree with you, we do have a lot of categories that some of them don't seem to make sense, such as the village mixed use, and then we use it for just, for something else without using the mixed component to that, and it's very confusing. And so I think to streamline that process is also a great idea. So I like where you're going, but again, it's a lot of information, and it's going to take a while to really absorb everything that you're talking about.
Well, and
Perfect, makes perfect sense, Commissioner. And I don't expect you to say, we just, what we would hope to get out of this seems like a reasonable, sensible strategy. Please continue to evolve it.
well, I agree with Commissioner Johns, and I'm not ready or prepared to say anything. You said you didn't need a decision today, but you need it soon, right? And this is a ton of information for us to sit down and to do it in less than an hour. I don't think it's fair for anybody to do that. And I think we need to get time, sit with planning, see their recommendations. I like what I see. I think y'all have done an excellent job. But to get this much information in 45, 47 minutes and make a decision, I don't think is a wise one. So, I mean, that's just my opinion. Mr. McCormick?
Was it not brought to attention earlier that she said that this conversation she just had with us has not been had with planning yet?
Yeah.
Am I correct?
Is that
So-
right? Ms. Moreno, is that right?
I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time
You
hearing
haven't,
Commissioner.
you haven't had
This conversation?
this conversation with planning yet?
No, we have had this conversation with planning. They have seen this presentation. They're aware of it.
Okay.
But they, like us, wanted you to see it. And Commissioner Anderson, you're correct. We're not asking for a decision today. We're asking you to we want to answer questions you may have so that you can go back and ponder it and think about whether this is a strategy worth moving forward on or not. So, does the idea of a sector map make sense? Does the idea of place types make sense? That's really the two questions we're asking you. Because the name of it, whether there are additional ones to it, whether the map needs to be tweaked, that will take a lot of time to figure out. But it's really whether of the four scenarios we're proposing, if that scenario is the one that makes the most, is that one that makes sense to move forward with.
Can I get one clarification?
Yes, go ahead.
It seems like the overall inventory of the county is simply come down to this, is they have designated where they feel the growing areas are going to be. It looks like we're faced with one or two options. Either raise density on what we have to accommodate it, or open up more opportunities for development. So I think that's where the crossroad is. Which one of these best suits? First, make a decision. Do we want to go more density with what we have, or do we want to open more up? And because you got to do one of the two. The growth is coming. So which?
Well, actually, I think yes and no. I think you have more options than that. You don't have to raise the density. You currently already have a lot of density that a lot of property owners are not taking advantage of. But, so there's a lot of people who have one-story buildings that could transition to four-story buildings. As Griddick showed, county-wide, you are developed at only 20% capacity than what your zoning allows across the county. So there, even under the existing zoning, you have enough capacity. You don't have to raise density anywhere. What you may choose to do is say, we may want to encourage density here and discourage density here. So what about a transfer of development rights, which says we're going to take the property rights, the development rights here and transfer them there, and then, the property owners are compensated by the developer who now gets a boon because they can develop more than they were currently allowed. That is a more realistic scenario, we think, rather than opening up the opportunity for future density haphazardly, let's say. Does that make sense?
It does, but there's some things I want to sit and look at in the rural areas because, and Mr. Clydewell, that's mostly in your district, so this is a question for you. But it's my opinion that in rural areas where have always been farms, there's a lot of people my age that have owned farms for 50 years, and they're dying out. And their children they're not farmers. They may be lawyers or doctors or work in the general store. But they're gonna wanna subdivide their property, if I'm not mistaken. Do you agree with that, Mr. Clydewell?
That seems to be the trend. Not saying I like it, but
No, I'm not either, but it's, we're walking a fine line here of, in my opinion, and Matt, you can weigh in, is,
Well, hopefully, Commissioner, you would encourage a trend to the rural centers or the rural place types, the rural settlement for those farmers who may have a lot of land, who may want to develop, and who have, and it's not more density, it's just recalibrating that density or redistributing that density.
I'm just, and I'd need to sit down with you and Mac after we had a little time to digest this. To be honest, some of the print on this, I couldn't read, it was so small. But I think you're headed in the right direction. There's just some things I want to look at and have some questions for you later.
Perfect sense.
I know we're losing our farms left and right, and and there's a lot of people that would like to buy a farm and just live in the middle of it. I understand that. I don't want to stop that either. So, but there's some things I want to look at a little more closely.
But, and just one question, and that goes along the lines of what I'm talking about on, do we need to increase some density in areas? Yeah, there's going to be some areas that we're probably maxed out. But I think currently up in the north end of the county, we have actually, for these families that want to develop their property, they don't want to farm no more. I think we have a 1 house per 50 acre zoning category. And to me, that needs to be relaxed a little bit for the families that don't want to farm no more. But just my opinion.
Mr. Clydewell.
I would have a hard time agreeing to that. I think maybe it's 1 to 40, and I think maybe some relaxation as far as around intersections and all makes sense, but I'm not crazy about. And the problem is there's no infrastructure to support large scale housing, but I do think there are some areas that I didn't say, but I want to look at this a lot closer, but such as the Highway 85 corridor, which has a lot of traffic. That does make sense for some development, but
It is only your large-scale agriculture that allows 1 unit for 40 acres. The minute it has residential, it's 1 for 5, I think.
yeah.
Okay.
If I may, Marina, this is Stephen. I know you can't see me in your screen, and I don't want to oversimplify anything or take away from the comments that the board is making. I guess I just want to try to refocus the board's attention and what I think that the purpose of the presentation was today, and that's to get guidance on one of those options, right? So I think more than anything what Marina and DPZ team are looking for is, because all the things that you've discussed thus far can be worked out, right? She's not suggesting we're increasing density or anything like that, or taking away farmland. Those are all details that can be sorted. What Marina's looking for is are we comfortable with the current system, the current way that we're handling things? Should we just tweak that a bit to make it work a little bit better, or better in general, or one of the other 3 options? And what Marina's made clear is that they're recommending the option that is sort of a hybrid from obviously going to a drastic shift
And finding a place in the middle where we use our current system, but we create these sectors where growth is desired, where it's not desired, where we protect the current land uses and provide some form, if you will, in how we want growth to occur in those areas that growth is desired. So
So that was option 3, right?
that
she
was, I believe that was the most recommended option, the 2-star option, right, Marina, that you showed in your slide?
Stephen, you're correct in what you're saying. What we hope you would agree, and you don't have to say it today, but if you think this is rational, is to develop a sector map, which is new, that defines areas of preservation, areas of growth, areas of worth maintaining, and then within those, certain place types would be applicable and certain would not. We're not asking you to say, this is where a place type would occur, because that has to be figured out. But it's the theory behind it.
Sounds good to me.
Sounds good to me.
Let's see what option 3 looks like on map.
Option 3, which one did you recommend, option
Option
2 or
3.
3?
Preservation,
We're
maintain, and growth.
recommending 3 because option 2 is essentially saying map place type without a sector map.
Okay,
You could also do that. It just means you have to be a little more proactive about where you map them. And it also means that you don't have the mechanism, that additional mechanism of the sector map to tell a property owner, no, you cannot do an urban center because it's not permitted by the sector map. We're not in a growth sector, so we think you should be scaling down your ambitions and doing, a village or a T&D, but not, or an urban corridor, but not an urban center. Both of them, just one gives you the flexibility to allow for greater choice within parameters of place types, and one requires that it be mapped now.
Mr. Chairman.
go ahead.
While I think 3 is the best option, number 4 sounds good in theory, but in talking to people in Orange County, it's very painful and takes a long time. And while you're trying to work out perfection, you're allowing what's the problems of today to still exist. So I think 3 makes sense as a next step. And
Yep.
I'm not really worried about urban centers developing in the middle of nowhere because the market will take care of stuff like that. It's not gonna, you're not gonna be able to do that. But I am interested in things like maybe some restrictions on height for residential, single-family dwellings. That may be the magic bullet that kills the monster houses. So there are things in there that are intriguing that I think might work, but I think option 3 gets us there the quickest and the most, with the most consensus. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I'd like to reiterate the 50-foot height limit, because you mentioned a few times about 4 stories developments. And I know that you've also mentioned that 50 feet is 50 feet and that we need to maintain that or less. Because right now, what we have, it was my understanding years ago that 50 feet was 50 feet, but with the formula that we used, it can go up to 67.5, as we well know, and that's really not
Right.
acceptable. So I would like to see it to ensure that it is no higher than 50 or even reduce that.
Well, it takes a 4-to-1 vote to raise it and a 4-to-1 vote to lower it.
Well, it's supposed to be, when it was voted in before, it's my understanding that it was voted in at 50 feet. How that formula got in there, I don't know. I don't think that formula was voted on.
Yes, ma'am, that formula is in the Land Development Code. It was voted on by the full BCC as part of the update to Land
Were they
Development.
aware of that it was in the LDC when they voted on it?
Yes, ma'am.
Well, it wasn't what was brought up
And it is
before
one of
my
those-
tenure.
It's one of those things that has created the character of South Walton that people want to pay a lot of money for.
I understand that you say that all the time, but there are a lot of developments, to her point earlier, that they keep it at the 50 feet and they have beautiful homes that are very nicely done. It doesn't have to go up to 67.5 feet and just kind of overpower everything surrounding it.
I absolutely support the architectural diversity that formula does provide. I mean, we've got 3,000 architecturally significant single-family homes within a mile of Seaside, according to Architectural Digest. That's a pretty incredible thing for our county. Now, with that said, I'm not opposed to that 50 feet being less than, something less than. Just to give you a little bit of a history, and I think we're all heading in the same direction here, because what we're trying to do is predict what we're going to have in the future by creating the right policies in the comprehensive plan and the right implementation regulations in the land development code that will deliver what you believe you want this county to be 15 to 20 years from now. To give you a little bit of a history, when the comp plan was originally adopted, we didn't have zoning. We used our future land use map, like every other community does, as a zoning map, where other communities have zoning, and we may be one of the last counties in Florida without zoning. But over the first 20 years or so of that implementation, the state has absolutely recommended that we reduce the number of future land use map categories because we essentially had a zoning map in the comp plan. That was not workable from it didn't provide the predictability that we needed. In 2018, when we did the last year, the board directed us to implement zoning. And we did that in such a manner to protect the entitlements that were already on the map. We didn't downzone anyone. What we did was we reduced the number of future land use map categories significantly, but we took those existing future land use map categories and pushed those down to the zoning map, so everyone still had the same entitlements in the zoning, within the zoning districts that they had in the future land use map districts, and we simplified the details. We took a lot of the detail out of the comp plan and put it in the land development code. That was a significant move in the right step. We are now here 7 years later, or we will be 7 years later when we complete this project. We're at the next crossroads. We need to take that next step. We need to, rather than just tweaking what we've got now, as you've heard, a very detailed analysis of why we need to do something different. And this is that iterative process that we've been on for the last 25 years, since the comp plan was originally developed. We need to focus now on really trying to determine what we're going to be in the next 15 or 20 years, where we're going to grow, where we're not going to grow. Do we need to take a look at reducing the maximum height for single-family residential? I think it may be time in certain areas of the county to do that. But this is a more outcome-focused approach, and that's what is being recommended in option number 3. We need to modify the system. I think we're all in agreement with that. This next decision is how we do that. Do we just tweak it a little bit? And that's not a recommendation. Do we do it for specific areas only? That's not a bad recommendation, but I think we need to do a more comprehensive approach that takes the whole county into consideration rather than just specific portions of it. But in that comprehensive approach, we're going to be looking at where we actually have the opportunity to grow, where we should grow, where we should not grow, and where we should possibly reduce some intensity that's already on the map and figure out a way to do that without it creating tremendous litigation from property owners against the county. That's the goal that I think that we ought to be moving to. That's certainly the sentiment of this board this morning. And that is our recommendation, that we move forward with approach number 3. Now, with that said, this is a tremendous amount of information to digest in one short meeting. So we're not actually asking for any formal vote or anything today. We're asking for sort of a nod of the head that this is the direction we need to proceed in and refine this approach. So the next thing we bring back to you is in more detail.
I think 3 of us have already nodded on that. I don't know about the other 2.
Yeah, I'm good with 3. Go ahead and let's taking a look at what it, dig down in it, look exactly what it looks like.
Y'all are gonna be coming around though, right?
I think we will absolutely be visiting with each individual commissioner to get a more detailed review of this and make sure that you understand what is being presented and we understand what your sentiments are and your direction is, where you want us to go. And that's what we'd like to do, or begin that process as the next step.
Okay, everybody agreeing on moving forward on 3?
Yes, sir.
Okay,
I'd like to see what 3 looks like on paper.
yeah. Okay, is that good for you, Ms. Morano?
Did I hear you say that you think it's okay to move forward on 3 as we make recommendations, understanding that you will be scrutinizing the sector map, you will be scrutinizing the place types, maybe suggesting other ones, maybe suggesting deleting some. We're okay with all of that. It's really, are you okay with the strategy for moving forward, as Mac described?
Yes, I think that's the consensus of the board.
Okay?
Commissioner Drake, did you have any?
That's
He shook
all
his
we need
head,
to have
yes.
today. We really appreciate it, and I don't want to intrude too much on Joe Minicosi's time. I know he's here, and he also has a very compelling presentation to show you.
Okay.
So I'll turn my screen off and turn it over to Joe. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Joe, if you would, spell your last name for the clerk.
Sure. My last name is Minicozy, and that's spelled M as in Mary, I, N as in Nancy, I, C-O-Z-Z-I, 2 Z's like zebra, and an I. I apologize for doing a presentation from a hotel room, but I'm sort of a refugee from Asheville right now.
Oh, no.
It is as bad as it looks from the images. It's pretty gut-wrenching, actually.
So sorry
And
to
what's
hear.
frustrating is we actually had a flood in 2004. And I'm just bringing this up since we're talking about planning. We didn't enact our plan from 2004, and a lot of the destruction that we have now in Asheville could have been prevented. As a taxpayer, it's super frustrating. But anyway, and also as a former Floridian, I've seen how communities can handle hurricanes, and now being up in the mountains where the water runs downhill faster, we missed an opportunity to protect a lot of people and a lot of property. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and start the presentation and share my screen. I don't want to be too dour. It's just kind of hard to avoid that sentiment. Let's see. So our role in this work is sort of, if Marina's team is the surgeon, we're sort of the radiologist. We're doing the economic analysis to see how things flow. A little background about my experience. This is downtown Asheville in the 1980s, 1990s. We essentially had a city that was asleep. We had an attitude that we weren't urban, we weren't a city place where rural mountain people. We sort of neglected what was right in front of us. I worked for a real estate developer, this man here, Julian Price, started a for-profit real estate development company with $25 million of his personal investment. And we basically could use that as a revolving fund to fix buildings. It also started businesses. We started a bunch of businesses to basically make downtown alive. The first vegetarian restaurants, some nightclubs, bookstores, things like that. But it was mostly about getting housing, a housing option for folks that wanted to live in the downtown. But what we found ourselves doing is communicating with our elected officials, because if we're a $25 million company, what are you? Is the county or the city? So if you look up the word incorporate, it says to constitute a company, a city, or other organization as a legal corporation. So by law, the city of Asheville is incorporated, my county is incorporated, my state is incorporated, so is our country. In 2016, then Vice President Joe Biden said to Stephen Colbert, the United States is the largest corporation in the world. And I'm such a nerd, I went and looked it up. There's, for any attorneys in the room, at the bottom of the slide is the U.S. code that lists this as a federal corporation. So we should understand the cash flow of how things operate. In our business, we do that. So for my city of Asheville, it's $14 billion of value. So that's like 7 times the value of Ted Turner. So Ted Turner just making a gut reaction or looking at Facebook. Of course not. He's looking at data to see what's going on in his business. And our communities should do the same. So my city is actually the only city in North Carolina that can't annex land. So all of that land is basically, that's all we have. Those are our widgets of productivity. Walton County can't annex the next county over. So what you all have is finite as well, and it needs to be managed. So we usually encourage folks, there's been a lot of conversation in this meeting about farming. When you talk to farmers, farmers talk in economic terms. What's the crop yield per acre, the water per acre, the labor per acre, and we should do the same with buildings. So this is a building that we rehabbed. It's ground floor retail, second floor office, and upper story residential. It used to be an old JCPenney's department store. We wouldn't have done this had it not been for the public investment. So the city built a streetscape, so thank you, city, for that. We took the taxable value from $300,000 to $11 million. So what the community got is 3,500% more taxes off that property. Our attitude is, that's great, we're building wealth, go out and buy 3,500% more garbage cans. We don't care. I mean, we want the community to grow its wealth. But there was always pushback from folks. They'd be like, well, that's $11 million. We've got this Walmart that's double the value. And what people miss here is the component of your finite commodity. So if you're just looking at the gross number of value, you're missing your sacrifice. So in our community, that Walmart took 34 acres of our farm to make 20 million versus our building on 0.2 acres producing 11 million. So that's apples and oranges. So per acre, we're producing 100 times more property taxes than that Walmart per acre, double the sales taxes, a lot more residents, obviously, and more jobs. So when you break things down into an acre analysis, it actually gives you a way better way of looking at your community from a productivity standpoint. Conversely, you can see where you're leaking out, where you're losing revenue. So I want you to know this isn't complex math that I'm doing here. It's just basically fifth grade division. This is something how we used to do real estate analysis back in the 1920s, and we've sort of forgotten it in modern times. But I'll give you a different way of looking at it. If I were to say, you know, I've got a pickup truck that gets 650 miles per tank, you'd immediately know that that's kind of silly because all tanks are different sizes. And you know how we don't say that when we gauge vehicles or check their productivity. What we do is we say miles per gallon, and the numbers change, and we should all be driving BMW Setas at 70 miles per gallon. Sorry to the Prius owners, but that's the most efficient vehicle in this chart. I'm doing this as a joke. It's a very dangerous little car. If you have a head-on collision in that thing, you're pretty much toast. But I'm showing you how we gauge productivity. So our recommendation is to do the same with the city. When you look at, we've done over, I think this is a sample of 60 different cities. For every dollar of taxes somebody in the county single-family unincorporated area is paying to the county per acre, their brother or sister in the city is paying about 5 times that to the same county. Here's the Walmart, there's the mall. This is a 2-story building, 3-story building, and 6-story building. This is all under the high-rise threshold. But as you stack stories and start to mix things up and do mixed use, you actually get more productivity out of your buildings. And this is just the facts of the data for communities. Incidentally, people, sometimes when they see my presentation, they think that I've got a problem with Walmart because I've brought them up a couple times now. And I'm just going to let you in on something. I presented at the International Association of Tax Assessing Officers Conference. I don't know if you hang out with your tax assessor. If you could imagine 3,000 of them in one room, it was a pretty nerdy conference. But this guy got up at 8:30 in the morning and did this amazing presentation on how cheap Walmarts are. So let that wash over you for a second. I mean, it was actually kind of brilliant. In one meeting, he's getting 3,000 of his properties lowered into value with one presentation. That's incredibly efficient. Now, I used to also work in government, and I was sort of having a heart attack because I was like, how is he getting away with this? You know, if you lower the value, you lower the tax production, which means you pay less to the community. So I went up to the microphone and I asked him, I said, Mr. Terrell, what's the useful life of one of your buildings? And he said, 15, 20 years, we depreciate the building as fast as possible. We don't care about the long-term value. So again, don't hate the player, hate the game. This is perfectly legal for him to do that. And in defense of the assessors, they don't look at the buildings from their cost to the community. The average Walmart consumes more in police services than it pays in property taxes. That's the reality of the math. So it's not their fault. But just for your corporation, these are very smart people, and they figured out how to minimize their pay into your community, which is fine. But just be aware of the cost and consequences. And what I usually tell people is, like, their commitment to your corporation is the life cycle of a cat. Like, that's it. This is a joke. I'm making a joke here. It's okay to laugh. I'm a dog person. It just understand the long-term effect of your community. And we would argue that people don't see it because it's not presented this way, in a way that you could see it. So if I can show you your brain with your creative thought process in green and your brainstem activity in blue, can I do your community this way? Can I show you an MRI of your community? So I'm just going to do a little sample here. This is my county, 350 square miles. We have a lot of non-taxable. This is Mount Mitchell Federal Park, so it's not taxable. Green is low value, purple is high value. This is the Biltmore Estate right there. That one property is worth $100 million, which is pretty cool. But it's really not a fair way of looking at it because it's got a 180,000 square foot house sitting on 8,000 acres of land. So that's like the biggest gas tank you could imagine, right? So rather than total value, let's do value per acre, and let's not stop there. Let me show it to you in 3D. We made this map when I was on the Downtown Association for Asheville because we had 2 voters out in the county for every 1 voter in the city, and they actually, one of our state representatives called us a cesspool of sin, which I'm not making this up. And rather than, in defense of folks that live out in the county, like people that live out in Fairview, they think they're paying a lot of taxes to the county, which is true compared to their cousins out here in Hickory Nut Gap. But they have no idea what we produce in downtown, which is this big purple mountain. So we felt obligated to share this information and show it and just have a conversation about it. So we're perfectly fine contributing to our county coffers, but just be aware of the land use effect of different decisions and where your productivity is. So it's about being transparent with the information. Additionally, you can see where Black Mountain was heavily hit with the floods. You can see where its little downtown is right there, popping up. And downtown Black Mountain, I think the tallest building is 3 stories tall. So it doesn't take skyscrapers to make value. You can have potency otherwise. So for y'all, this is basically, think of us as doing a CAT scan for the planning team. We're coming into Florida. Florida's different than North Carolina. You have a different tax system. So whenever we have to go to a community, we have to, and we've got about 27 different counties in Florida. In North Carolina, it's real simple. We have a market value equals taxable value. There's a couple of exemptions if you're a disabled veteran, but that's it. It's a fairly straight, simple tax system compared to y'all. In Florida, you have the homestead exemption cap, Save Our Homes, basically, to get to your taxable value. And there's a lot of other things that come along with Save Our Homes, portability and other things that basically constrict the revenue. But if we were to just take $100,000 of commercial and $100,000 of residential and start at the beginning, right out the door is a resident of, if you're a homeowner, you get $50,000 taken off your value, and only $25,000 removed if it's in a school district, and that knocks you down to $50,000 of value versus the $100,000 of commercial. When you apply your tax rate, this is what the tax bill looks like. Oftentimes, folks don't, particularly for taxpayers, it feels good to vote for amendments that remove your tax burden, but you have to pay for things as a government. You have to pay for roads and pipes and police officers and stuff like that. So folks just aren't conscious of the fact that they foist a burden onto the commercial properties, but that's the reality of the tax situation. You also have some strange loopholes in your tax system. There's farming, and then in Florida you can actually just rent a cow and just have it walk around the property and you get an agricultural exemption. So just be aware of that. If you want to save your land, if it's going to be actually farmed in agriculture, then that's a good thing. It's productive for your community. But back to Save Our Homes for a second. This is a chart we made about Brevard County. And if you see the gap, blue is where the market is, and red is where the tax restriction is. So because there's a cap on it, it suppresses where value is. And it feels good as a homeowner when the market takes off and I'm paying taxes at the red line and not the blue line, right? So look what happens after the recession is that the world craters and then it starts climbing back out. But because of the restrictions and the caps, your revenue doesn't keep up. And that's just the reality of what you all have to handle the budget. You're fiduciary responsible for the corporation of the county, and your revenues have this restriction. When you look at 2022, inflation was at 7%, but your revenues were capped down at 3%. So let's take a look at that for a second. So this is where the cost of concrete and asphalt, a sheriff's car, all of that was following 7%, but you all had a revenue restriction at 3%. So there's this perverse incentive that you actually want to have more people come to your community so that you can keep up with expenses. Just looking at asphalt, this is Florida DOT. In the last 10 years, asphalt's been growing at 5% average. If you were to look at the consumer price index of asphalt just from 2021 to 2022, it grew by 30%. So your revenues don't grow by that, right? So this is, I put these in here more as a, to help you with communicating to your citizens that these are the things that you wrestle with when you look at your budget on a day-to-day basis. So back to your budget, we made a couple of charts. On the left is your revenue at a county-wide level and where the money comes from. It's majority property tax. You get a very healthy 19% from tourism taxes. And then this is your outlay. This is where it gets spent. The majority of it is in public safety. And then coming in at number 2 is capital outlay for projects. And the capital outlay is where you have your big expenses for physical things that you have to pay for. But anyway, we like to make charts, so we made these. And I know I'm flying through information, but you'll have a PDF of this. But your property taxes are things that we can put on a map and share and show. This is another chart to show your flow of the very similar data. It's just your pie chart broken into a flow chart. So property taxes are at the top. The majority of the property taxes goes into this fund bucket, which spills into public safety. But this is just another flow chart to show the flow. So this fund here, the Economic Development and Capital Outlay Fund, this is where it gets spent in your community. The majority of that is for beach nourishment and infrastructure at 44% of the Economic Development and Capital Outlay bucket. So for your community, this is your county as a total value. So think miles per tank. You can see some large parcels back in here that are purple and some yellows in here. When you go from total value to value per acre, you see a big shift where you can now see Defuniak Springs that pops up, and you see this kind of heat at the coast, but this is it in 3D. This is very expected of a Gulf community that has a phenomenal beach environment. You have a lot of value at the beachfront in the South County. But you have areas as you go into Mid and North County where you can start to see the towns and villages popping up versus the rural agricultural lands. It is great to have agriculture. On one side, you don't get a whole heck of a lot of taxes out of it, but on the flip side, agriculture, like an ear of corn doesn't call the sheriff. It doesn't need to go to school. Their agricultural needs are just less of a burden on your community. The tricky part is once you start adding people in who aren't farmers, then you start to add cost to your community. But anyway, these are the different developments highlighted out. There is a distinction between something like Seaside, Alice Beach, and Rosemary Beach. You can see how they pop up versus the other types of development that are along the coast. And I'll zoom into those in detail in a second. But here's Defuniak Springs. You can see where its center is, and its Main Street. There's some effort that you could collaborate with the community on to grow their wealth inside their community that they should also focus on. And as they enhance their value, that's going to increase benefit to county coffers as well. But the downtown of Defuniak Springs is a footprint of the city, is 0.2% of the footprint. Physically, financially, it's 4% of the tax value. So that's a 1 to 10 ratio productivity. That's really good. So from a standpoint of what's your footprint physically to your footprint financially, a good downtown is somewhere around 1 to 6. And so this is outperforming a typical downtown. You can increase this. You can actually grow more value there. But this is a good lesson as you look around the county and you think about the value of what Marina just talked about for those urban corridors. This is a good example. It's basically what your great-grandparents did in Defuniak Springs. When you look at the coast, we look at something like Rosemary Beach is phenomenal. It has its own little downtown, and you can see that it's coming in at purple value, which starts at around $75 million an acre. So just the little core of Rosemary Beach, if we were to consider that its downtown, it's 7% of the town of Rosemary Beach, if you will, in footprint. It's 13% of the town's value, so that's a 1 to 2 ratio. One of the reasons why that's low is because of the value all along the beach and what goes past it. You see it's all like reds and oranges back here. So there's just so much more value in Rosemary Beach throughout the town, which kind of dilutes the value of its downtown. But both lessons are great. You know, build more towns is one of the examples here. These are lessons that you all have in your community that you can use. One of the other things that we did in the analysis was just turn off the buildings and look at the land value per acre. And I want to give you a little bit of a bias that's with a lot of assessment analysis. And I'll just show you this example, one of the most obscene ones that we've seen. This is Cheyenne, Wyoming, and there's no buildings in this picture. So if you look at this neighborhood up here, you can see how everybody's kind of blue just under the key here, that's label. So that means everybody's dirt is the same value per acre. That seems reasonable. When I was presenting this to the community, I asked what was going on with this land here, and you could tell there's a mall on top of it. But again, there's no buildings here from a data standpoint. So the dirt under the mall is $15,000 an acre. When you cross the street in the same zoning category, the dirt doubles in value just by crossing the street. And I asked the community, I said, why does that happen? And the tax assessor raised her hand and just yelled into the room, well, it's because you don't understand, this person has more land, and the more land, the lower the value, because less people can afford a larger tract of land, and so we have to give it a discount. The mayor just started laughing, and everybody in the room kind of gasped, and I'm like, so I get more of your land and you give me a discount? And she goes, yeah, that's our standard. And I said, well, you've got 3 miles of street around this property, and this fellow over here's only got 200 feet. She goes, no, we don't care about infrastructure. That's not part of the valuation. I said, so you don't care about ever recouping that cost? And she goes, that's not our concern. And that was kind of a shock for people, but more shocking to me was this standard that I get a discount. So does that work this way with other commodities? If I get a bigger diamond, is it cheaper? I mean, surely less people can afford a big diamond, right? And she just didn't get it. So that's one of the reasons why I went to the assessors conference, was to ask them about this. I'm not making this up. Their magazine is called Fair and Equitable. And I asked them, how is it fair and how is it equitable? To their credit, they said it's not. And I said, well, where did this standard come from? Did Moses deliver this to you? By the way, this joke killed them at the assessors conference. They thought this was funny. But they said, no, you need to talk to Larry Clark. And so I tracked this guy, Larry Clark, down, and I asked him about the standard, and he said, well, now that you point that out, it's not fair, it's not equitable, we probably need to change it. So just be aware that you have humans practicing assessment, and there are opportunities to have an engaged conversation with your assessor to figure this stuff out. And there's a lot of leeway in what you could do. But this is your land value per acre. And again, what you'd expect, there's a big wall of value along the Gulf, but notice how inconsistent it is. Some areas have more value in the dirt than others, and that really should be evaluated. But this is a parcel in Alice Beach. It's coming in at $78 million an acre of value. Frankly, its neighbors should kind of be the same value. It should be more level, but it is what it is. This is your data. And when you zoom in, you can see how much it dissipates from Rosemary to Alice to the adjacent communities, or even between Rosemary and Alice. It's the same Gulf. So why is the value different? Now, this could be that it's the development of design actually impregnates the land with value as well. So design actually can increase the wealth of your community. And you see this hard break once you get across 98, it sort of dissolves immediately. When Marina talks about developing designed communities, you actually have the ability to create wealth in the land by how it's designed. So again, these are just different snapshots from around your community, and you can see, again, there's no buildings here. This is just dirt. So just for the sake of it, we looked at just this little strip over here from Inlet Beach over to Sand Cliffs, just to kind of dig a little deeper into the dirt. So if we look at Sand Cliffs, this is more typical. The first wave by the beach is pulling about an average of 8 million. As you cross the street, it goes to 6 million, cross the street again, it goes to 4 million. And by comparison, so it is stepping down the way you'd expect, the further away from the coast, 8, 6, 4. If you just go over to Alice Beach, this is 78 million. It's a huge jump once you just cross a property line. And so, you know, I don't know if it's because they've got the protection of the buffer. When you look at Rosemary Beach, you can see the same thing, where the first wave past the buffer, you're getting 38 million. So you're seeing that same value and effect in those design communities versus the kind of the more traditional gated access on Sand Cliffs. So again, we just produced these because we saw it in the data, and it's worth the conversation with your assessor. It's also worth the conversation to talk about what's the value of a privatized beach versus an area that has more public access, because that's something that you can have that conversation about the valuation of whether or not it's captured when somebody puts a little sign up and says it's their private beach. Are they being valued for that? This is all spatial analysis. This joke only works for certain crowds, but I like the joke. So your land uses, just to go through some examples. So think of the map as a big bar chart, and these are individual properties within that bar chart. So your Walmarts are somewhere between $400,000 and $800,000 an acre of productivity. So on average, you're about $500,000. So is what a Walmart is. And so I'm going to have the Walmart on the bottom of every slide for this section, just so that you can have a control. So down here, here's Walmart at 500,000. Your single-family residential is double a Walmart in property value on average. When you get into different types, these three here, you can see the diversity of typologies, but also the diversity in value. 1.3 million an acre for this small duplex, 2.2 million for the Freeport townhomes. Remember, average single-family is 1 million. But this is about 4 times a Walmart right here, and then this is 42 million an acre of value, significantly more. But on average, your townhomes are averaging about 5 times single-family value as tax production. That's more, almost 6, really. When you get into your multifamily, again, it's kind of all over the map, but generally, on average, we have these two are 800,000, let's call it 2 million on the right, 3.8 million at the residences. Watersound's pulling 3.4 million. In Seaview Apartments is about 6, let's call it 6 million. But on average, your multifamily is about twice what single family is. A lot of folks have misnomers about multifamily. They tend to think that it brings down value. It actually is, in most cases, pretty potent in communities that we've analyzed. And then this is kind of crazy. This is the most potent building in your entire county. It doesn't look that way from the street. It's just a little 3-story building, but it's pretty close to the coast. This is in Alice Beach, and this is pulling $158 million an acre of productivity. And again, there should be questions about why is this potent, and how do you replicate this, or what can we learn from this? But you know, from a data perspective, this is it. This is the most potent building at 158 million. So it's the top spike in the model right there. So the reason why it's so potent is it's a $9.1 million home on 0.05 acres. So it's a really tiny parcel, and somebody paid a lot of money for it. So just to kind of recap, your single family is at 1.1 million, your multifamily is about 2 million, and your townhomes are about 6 million. Your commercial stuff, you can see it steps back down again. Really, the reason we're down to 500,000 for the Lowe's, which is about the Walmart, 600,000 for your Publix. Well, actually, your Publix are 600 and 800,000. Really, it comes down to the size of the parking lot and the architecture of the building. So, if you build a really cheap box and use a lot of parking, you're going to dilute the value and tax production in your community, and that's the simple lesson with commercial. So these are all under $1 million. These here started around $1 million. In Santa Rosa, you can see that just strip of commercial is about 900,000. The Santa Rosa Plaza is 1.3 million. The Watercolor Crossing is 1.5 million, and 30 Avenue is coming in at 2.2 million. Part of the reason why 30 Avenue does so well is you have two-story buildings now. It's denser, so you're getting more production. The more stuff you put on the space, the more productive it is from a tax-based standpoint, is the simple lesson. And then you can learn from your grandparents and great-grandparents, too. These buildings are coming in at 2.4 million. I mean, who would have thought that Katie Beth's was that potent, but it is. The Hotel de Funiac's coming into almost 4 million an acre, and then Soiree is coming in at 7 million an acre. So it's very similar to what you see with the new urbanist projects as they replicate this typology. So it makes sense why they're so potent from a development standpoint. So back to your mixed uses to close this out. Now we're starting at 10 million, 20 million of value. So this building on the right is about 40 times the production of a Walmart. And then going back to this old stuff, just remember, these buildings were built, this one's 1913, and it's still sitting here. This wasn't sophisticated technology that built these buildings. This was common sense back 100 years ago, and this is pulling $7 million an acre. So it's been doing it for 100 years. This wasn't designed to fall apart after 20 years. So just be aware of that and maybe lean into the buildings that can provide wealth for your great-grandkids going forward. And again, you know, these people that built this stuff, they had horses when they built this stuff, and it's still there, pulling 800,000, 2.2 million, 2 million, 3 million, respectively. So this heritage is all around you. So to look at Katie Beth's for a second and compare it against the Walmart, this is the footprint of Katie Beth's under the picture right there. That's how big it is compared to the Walmart. So to make Katie Beth's equal to Walmart, you would need about that many Katie Beth's to equal one Walmart. So if you view your land as sacred and you're trying to maintain balance of agriculture, environmental protection areas, how much of that land that you have left for development do you want to blow through? So one project can take all of this over here, and you could have 59 of Katie Beth's and would only consume that much area to equal that same value of $7 million. Does that make sense? There's just a different way of looking at the same data, just trying to show you the land effect of this stuff. So you'll get the same value out of these, but two totally different footprints. To compare South Walton, the village of South Walton Beach versus 30A, this is the village of South Walton Beach. This is the size of 30A. So on the left, it's 122 million. On the right, it's only 28 million. So to make them equal, you'd literally have to rip off 2/3 of the village on the left to make it equal the thing on the right. Does that make sense? So that's the potency that you get out of that. And again, we're just randomly grabbing these to show you different ways of thinking of your community's development impact. As Marina talks about building cores, and as a developer may say, I don't want to do that, there's a trade-off that's happening financially that'll have an effect on your community. So to use the Walmart versus this building, you just need a little postage stamp of the village to equal to that Walmart. Now again, I'm sort of making a joke about this. I know that these are two totally different types of buildings, but there's a trade-off for that typology. You're going to get cheaper goods out of that Walmart, but there's a reason why it's cheaper. There's an exchange of value that's happening because of the building typology. To just make it a little bit more reasonable, comparing it against the Santa Rosa Plaza, again, it's just a tiny little piece of the village would equal that. So just to recap, I've gone through a bunch of examples. I call this the Brady Bunch slide, but it's like a grid from residential across the top, we have low density, medium density, high density, commercial properties, low, medium, and high, mixed use. You don't really have any low density mixed use, but you've got some medium and some high density stuff. But this is just to look at the average of each of these, and you can see how much it goes. The less you put on the land, the lower the production. And then the more you put on the land, the higher the production. And that's how this grid works. Think of this as a cheat sheet as you go forward. You can just, it's just something you should amend every year. But this is how it stacks up as a bar chart on how they all work. So this is just a synopsis of your data and what's going on there. So back to your model, one of the things that we've done with the DPZ team is provide this example so they can see as you go in, what are some different choices you have in your community and what are the financial effects of them. And they're different as you go from the coast northern. You're going to have different responses for the different land use patterns because they're different cultures of land settlement. But over the verandas of Freeport, we're looking at that compared to the Holiday Inn, let's say. The Holiday Inn is 4.6 million per acre versus the verandas. This is just showing you the buildings where they are in different areas. Gulf Place Town Center is pulling 69 million an acre. The Beach Walk Villas doing quite well at 85 million. But when you compare it against other beach resorts, you can see it's like this is almost twice the productivity, and it's a much smaller building. Again, it's just examples to show you what's going on in the model. To compare a couple of examples along the coast. Come on now. Oh. Sorry, my computer's freezing up here. This is Seacrest Beach. And just to give you a couple of stats, we're just going to do things side by side. So this is Seacrest side by side with Alice Beach. And they're literally side by side physically. And as you know, Alice Beach is not really fully built out yet, but it's actually crushing it from a value standpoint. So the total market value is about $1.8 billion for Seacrest and $2 billion for Alice Beach. The acreage, however, is more acres in Seacrest than Alice Beach, so that the top value of the model is 3 times that over in Alice Beach versus the Seacrest. But to look at it on an average for the whole thing, you're getting about 1.5 times the potency in Alice Beach today, or actually last year, with what's out there. That's going to continue to thicken up and get more potent. To give you an example where that could go, we dropped Seaside and Rosemary in. Rosemary learned a lot of different lessons from that development pattern that are different from what Seaside did 40 years ago. But Seaside's doing quite well at 14 million an acre of average value, and Rosemary is at 18. I don't know where Alice Beach is going to go. I could guess it's probably going to be close to 20 million an acre when it's done, but it's just kind of a very, very high potency. But what's kind of interesting here is notice the land consumption. So Rosemary Beach is about half, actually less than half, the total consumption of Seacrest, and they're literally side by side. But you see the value difference, $2 billion, or $1.9 billion on half the acreage versus $1.8 billion on double the acreage. So just, these are examples of typologies that are right there next to each other. And then these are other examples along the coast, and Water Sound, Miramar Beach, and Inlet Beach. And now we've gone from 8 to 18 million an acre to 1.6 to 7. And I would argue that this is a design difference. It's also a density difference. As you do less density, you also get less potency, and that's just a trade-off. So just be aware of that, and that's what's going on with these communities. So to compare Rosemary Beach side by side with Inlet Beach, I mean, they're literally right next to each other. They're about the same acreage at 103 acres versus 109 acres. The peak value in Rosemary Beach is 134 million. The total value is 2 billion. Inlet Beach is 800 million. The average value per acre is 18 million and 7.6 for Inlet Beach. And again, these are sort of apples to oranges, but we just want to give you apples to apples metrics to look at things, to see the results financially that different design decisions have to y'all at the tax level. So we're just being agnostic about this is what happens financially with these. To compare Sandestin Resort with Seaside, Sandestin Resort is more valuable at 1.6 billion, so it's 1.5 times the potency of Seaside, but it took 220 acres versus Seaside at 70. So another way of looking at it, well, what if your predecessors, your parents had decided, let's do something with Sandestin Resort, we want 2 seasides. That's basically what you could build in the boundary, actually 3 seasides would fit in the boundary of Sandestin. So right now you have 1.6 billion. If you'd had 3 seasides, you'd be at 3 billion on the same footprint. And again, these are choices that could have happened along the way. So as Marina talks about, if you encourage that mixed use typology that you already know about in your community, this will be the financial effect to those decisions. And it may be worth the choice, it may not be, it's up to you. The coastal effect, the other thing we did is we sliced up your model into, as you all know, you have different types of communities as you go northward. So this is just looking at that layer from 98 to the coast is averaging about $700,000 an acre for that whole strip. When you go from 98 and follow the line over to Lafayette Creek Wildlife Area, you can see how it's an odd shape, but this is kind of like the south central area is about 22,000. That's a precipitous drop down, which you'd expect coming off the coast. As you get into north central, it drops down again, and the far north is at 3,000. And again, these are just different zones, different typologies. You're going to have different communities in those zones. This at the north end of your county is highly agricultural. It's going to be low value. It is what it is. There's nothing wrong with that. But anyway, we just broke those down so you all can see them in layers. And also just looking at comparing the west or the south side, south of 98, against everything else. We went ahead and made those models as well so you can learn from them. But basically the average, the total acres are 650,000 acres north of 98 and 30,000 south. The total value is 46 billion versus 14. And you're looking at the average value per acre at 23,000 north of 98 and 700,000 south of 98. Again, this is probably not a shocker for you all. You know your community. We just went ahead and ran the stats for you. Taxable, non-taxable, you have 43% of your county is non-taxable. A lot of the stuff is part of the Air Force, but also you've done a great job preserving open space, which is great for other reasons. I'm just speaking as a current disaster victim. Having that land for the water to go into in a storm event is going to save a lot of damage in your community. So you should be commended for what you've done with all of this space. Let's see, this is looking at your market effect versus your taxable effect. So we did these to help you communicate to your taxpayers that when they clamor for things like tax caps and everything else, there's a financial effect. So on the left is what the market says it is, and on the right is how you're actually taxing it. It doesn't show up well in this model, so let me drill in. This is a different way of looking at it. So you have in dark blue what gets exempted off. So you see a lot of agricultural exemption going deeper northward into your county. As you are in mid-county, that's a lot of homeowner exemptions. But as you know, the investment properties don't get that homeowner exemption. So you see it start to fade out as you get closer to the coast. This is a zoom into Freeport to show you, sorry, we thought this was kind of a fun looking staircase there, but as you look at these 3 properties here, these are 3 houses side by side by side, and you see the different exemptions that they have on each property. So unfortunately, from a municipal standpoint, you have to provide the same service to all 3 of those properties. Yet because of the state tax policy, the one on the top is only getting 1% exemption. The one in the middle is getting 28% off, and the bottom one is getting 87% of a tax discount. And again, you don't have control over those policies, but you have the ability to communicate to your citizens that this has an effect on your budget. So we just wanted to come up with a simple graphic to show that to you all, and what's going on in your community. I hope this helps. So this is your total market value. This is what you're capped at, and so you lose 8% of your value countywide because of the cap. And that's to these policies of Save Our Home, agricultural exemption, and the 10% assessment cap at commercial. So commercial homeowners can go up to 3% or CPI, which is ever lower of the two. Commercial goes beyond that to 10%. So commercial doesn't get the same restriction that residential does. But basically, this is what you're actually taxing. So you're losing another 28% on other additional homestead exemptions, over the age of 65 exemption, disabled veterans. So it's, when you look at the county that you're managing a $55 billion county, but you're doing it on a $37 billion budget. Does that make sense? This is just, we try to provide a graphic to help you explain that to your taxpayers. So it's an $18 billion difference, or a 33% reduction in what you're managing versus where your finances come in. So you have about 33,000 single-family homes. About 1,000 of them are owner-occupied, so the pink stuff, and 1,000 of them are vacation rentals. So the owner-occupied stuff, those are your residents, they get a tax exemption. These folks are paying full freight. So there is a benefit to having those vacation rentals, because they're essentially a commercial product, producing that wealth for your community. When you look at the total cap, you're getting about $4 billion taken off the value of the houses. When you look at the cap for the commercial properties, remember that's got a 10% cap for them, but it's about 21% taken off versus 45% for your homeowners. So if you're to go back to your budget and say, well, what was taken off in the system? You're getting about, that little pink line is coming from your homeowners. The yellow line is coming from vacation rentals. You're getting all of your tourism tax from vacation rentals. So you're getting about 47% of your revenue for your physical product that's coming in from tourists, 14% from owners, and 39% is coming from everything else. Again, we're trying to just find different graphics to help you communicate this stuff. Conservation easements, again, these are trade-offs. They're not going to be productive from a tax standpoint, but they're going to save you other things. They're going to produce stormwater remediation. They're not going to have as much community services, and they're just not that valuable. But it is what it is. You're going to see trade-offs and other things. So the productivity of your easements are a 1 to 5/10,000ths of a percent. I mean, it's really a small percentage. To show you the comparison, the verandas at Freeport, how much of verandas would equal the value of all of Lafayette? It's basically this much of the verandas would equal all of Lafayette. So this is showing you the potency of the verandas, but it's also showing you the lack of potency that you get with the wildlife areas. But again, you know this going in, that there's going to be this trade-off. If you're to look at it from a seaside perspective, it's just basically a couple parcels, 3 parcels will do it. So just to close on this, I mentioned this several times, the patterns affect your valuation and affect how you pay for things. This is a sample of housing in South Bend where we did the cost side. So we took 88 houses in basically a 1920s subdivision, and did the analysis of the roads, the sewer and stormwater, and water pipes. There's a total cost of $122,000 of cost to community services. And we did the same 88 houses done in this pattern. So again, residential property, different land use pattern. This is a cul-de-sac with cul-de-sacs on it. Did their cost, and let me just put them side by side. So these are the cost in pipes, about the water, same water pipes. It's more sewer pipes, and stormwater on the right versus the left. It's significantly more roads, about double the cost of roads in a cul-de-sac pattern versus a grid pattern. And the actual costs amount to 1.5 times more in the suburban pattern that's modern versus the suburban pattern that's traditional and old. But when you look at the revenues paid in both cases, residential doesn't pay for itself, but so you're paying about the same residential, but your costs are way more. So the deficit on the left is about $57,000, and on the right, it's double that at $100,000. So as a developer, build in a community and say, well, people want the cul-de-sacs, there's actually an implicit trade-off that's happening financially, that we're consuming more infrastructure and paying less for it. You know, and that's, again, make sure that you're aware of these consequences over the long haul. To look at it more macro level, we did this for Springfield, Missouri. This is the revenue. In Missouri, it's mostly sales tax. So we stacked the property tax on the sales tax. This is the money coming out. So here it is a capital stack. And then we looked at the cost side down into the ground. So this is what they're paying in their coffers to do this. So you've got above the water is the money coming out of the ground, below the water is the cost. So think of this as a boat floating in the bay. This is a side view of the boat. There's the revenue above the water line, and there's a sunk cost below the water line. This is the net position of what's in black is net positive, what's in the red is net negative. So this is how the city looks like financially. So they're at a deficit of $48 million. But you really should think about the land use patterns, but also how policy affects it. So in their case, 20% of the community is floating the 80% with it. And this is a subsidy on the model. So to close, if you're not measuring it, you can't manage it. You should have these data points going forward. Y'all are a $51 billion corporation. So you're the board of directors for a $51 billion corporation. If you liquidated Walton County, you can buy 12 New Orleans Saints. I don't know if Tyson Hill is still on the team, but the owner knows, Gil Bernson knows his towel bill. You know, I know that the cups in our nightclub cost 5 cents a pop. You need to know this data when you make decisions. So think of where your leaks are, understand your revenue stream, and just to close, look for examples of production and replicate them. Sorry, I went a little fast there. And replicate them. You have these data points now. Have these conversations going forward. Consider the spatial consequences of spreading out. It gets expensive when you stretch out. Also consider the trade-offs and how to preserve land, but where do you grow that wealth in exchange? Understand the implications of your tax system. We did these models so you can better understand what happens when state policy is enacted and what that means to your bottom line and what you lose in the process. Understand the maps and costs. That should be your next step, is map the costs of all of this stuff. A lot of our work is covered in this book by Charles Marone. I recommend it to a lot of folks, and thanks for letting me do some math. I'm done.
Any questions?
That was phenomenal. Thank you very, very much. Very, very enlightening.
Just one, Mac, do we have these slides available to us to
Yes,
look
sir.
at our leisure?
Yes, sir, and they are attached to the published agenda for the public's benefit also. They can see the exact same things in PDF form.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Any other questions for Joe?
No, but I just want to say thank you for taking your time to do that amidst your disaster that you've been dealing with. So good luck. Hope your home's okay, and thank you very, very much.
Okay.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Joe, that was an excellent presentation, and I don't know how you did it with what's going on in Asheville, but thank you. And God bless you, and I hope everything works out for your beautiful city.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
Okay, then there's no motion involved, so there's no public comment, so this meeting's adjourned.
Thank you.
There will be